So this plan offered funding and equipment to all the Allied countries, as well as the USSR and its satellites, but Stalin rejected this aid and forced the Eastern European states to do so as well. By the time this program wound down in 1951, the United States had given $13 billion in various different forms of assistance. The Marshall Plan effectively restarted the European economy, allowing industrial and agricultural production to pass pre-war levels and even go beyond that. And this laid the foundation for a massive economic boom across Europe. So, what do we mean by a Cold War? Well, there's a definition is a state of permanent hostility between two powers which never erupts into an armed confrontation or a hot war. But now, like any war, you need to be able to conduct a war. You need to be able to get involved, and it needs various different things to make it run and work. So one of the main means used in the Cold War is the US dollars. The US pumped millions and millions of dollars into maintaining this Cold War. Military force. There was no engagement, but the greater the military force, the more chance your enemy is going to be fearful of attacking you. So there was that. There was also the accumulation of nuclear warheads. So nuclear arsenal was built up. And this, of course, resulted in mutual fear. There was alliance systems. Who was allying with what? Who was aligning? Which countries were coming together? Economic warfare. There was propaganda. Of course, there was espionage. Think James Bond, all the spies going on between the countries. And of course, there was a lot of secret operations in order to ensure that the one was better than the other. Hey there, Grade 12s, welcome back. Now, I hope you've had a good break. You've listened to what I've had to say. You've gone and had a look at some of your notes. You would have covered this in class anyway. But now the first question, the type of question you can get, would be as follows. Discuss.
US Secretary of State George Marshall outlined his plan to reconstruct Europe's economy. Aid was to be given in the form of food, grants for buying equipment, improvement of transport systems, and investment. The proposal, adopted in April 1948, was known as the Marshall Plan, or the European Recovery Programme. The US administration wanted economic recovery and political stability in Europe, including in those countries such as the United Kingdom, France and Italy, which faced financial hardship after the Second World War. France organised a conference to discuss the Marshall Plan, inviting representatives of several East European countries, including Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Romania and Yugoslavia. The Kremlin, however, rejected the proposed plan as an intrusion into the internal affairs of sovereign countries. Although Poland and Czechoslovakia had initially accepted the American offer, the Soviets forced both these countries, as well as Albania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary and Finland, to refuse US aid. On the 22nd of September 1947, the Committee of European Economic Cooperation presented a draft reconstruction plan to the Americans. After several months of debate, on the 2nd of April 1948, the US Congress approved $6.8 billion in credit to cover the first 15 months and promised further aid installments in the future. The Soviet news agency TASS commented harshly that the program's beneficiaries had given in to American imperialists who would lead the world to disaster. The 16 European countries taking part in the Marshall's European Recovery Program formed the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OECD. During more than 4 years of the Marshall Plan funding, these countries received $13.2 billion in American aid, partly in the form of credit.
The series of countries and the set of countries that we know and understand today. Another kind of question you could get, these are important to see your understanding. List and explain the differences between the United States and the United Soviet Socialist Republics during the Cold War era. So if you remember correctly, the ideologies of capitalism and communism are vastly different and are actually diametrically opposed to each other. So let's have a look briefly at the United States. Well, first of all, the United States, as part of the Western forces, were the victors in the war, which meant although they'd spent a lot in fighting this war, they were the winners, they came out wealthy. Now, the capitalist way of looking at things is that the country holds free and fair elections. In the United States, there was freedom of speech. It was very common for people to stand up and talk about their leaders and oppose them without being shot down or without being criticized. There's a free media. In the United States, there were other personal freedoms. People could do and go and do all sorts of things that would have been controlled in other countries. They were allowed to have private business and grow their own wealth. And all individuals were free to make their own profits. Now, the problem is completely different, and the lifestyle was completely different in Russia and in the Soviet republics. No free elections. The government owned and censored the media. There was no freedom of speech for the community and for the citizens of the countries. There was also a restriction on any personal freedoms they might have. Nobody could own their own business because all business and all money-making enterprises were owned by the government. And any profits that were made were owned and kept by the government to be distributed equally amongst all citizens or all comrades in the Soviet country. Quite a distinct difference, wouldn't you say? And finally, another question that you're liable to get is, how did the end of World War II impact and affect the Cold War? Now, this was interesting because the tensions between the two countries was evident prior to World War II. There was always an element of tension between the West and Russia. So, the Cold War represented a series of localized conflicts and intense diplomatic rivalries. Now, what happened here was there was an incredible bringing together of ideas and thoughts in order to be allied against the West. But by the end of the Cold War, the tensions and the mistrust and the, I wouldn't say hatred, but the worry and the fears of the two superpowers was amplified and magnified. Because this era saw a massive increase in civilian and military technology. And there was no idea of how this technology would be used, either for good or for bad. And this includes thousands of nuclear weapons and the means to deliver them across the world. So there was a special focus on the roles of the United States and Soviet Union after that, because the two superpowers were actually at each other's throats, as well as trying to develop and grow the European economy and the devastation left by the war. So the end of the Second World War resulted in a growth of economy, a growth in technology, but also an increase in the tension and the resistance between the two different ideologies of communism and capitalism. So there we have it, guys. There you can see how the tensions in the Cold War was impacted through the war. Now, if you want to see lessons on this, if you want to see anything more that will help boost your understanding and give you more information, you'll find it if you go to www.iwas.co.za. There you'll find lessons, you'll find tests, you'll also find quizzes to test your knowledge. And remember, this is only the start of an incredible journey through the history of humankind. See you soon. Good luck.
During the second half of the 20th century, the world's two major powers were engaged in a face-off without direct confrontation for almost 45 years. Let's trace on a map the chain of events that shaped the Cold War. At the end of World War II, major European powers are weakened after more than 60 million deaths over 6 years of fighting. Two superpowers remain in the world, the United States of America and the USSR, who fought together as allies to defeat Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan. The USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, is a vast area covering 1/6 of the land surface of the planet. It is a federal state under a communist regime consisting of 15 republics and headed by a single party. The United States of America is a liberal democracy based on capitalism. It has a military edge, being the only power with nuclear weapons, and also boasts the world's strongest industry and economy. Both powers try to peddle their influence in Europe. The US, under its Marshall Plan, offers substantial loans to European countries to revive the economy and establish trade links. The USSR, for its part, wants to protect its borders and set up pro-Soviet governments in liberated countries. Europe is found divided into two blocks and separated by what is called the Iron Curtain. In Germany, Allies merged territories they control in violation of agreements signed with the Soviets. In response, the Soviet Union imposes a blockade on West Berlin, which is still under Allied control. An airlift is set up to bring supplies to the area. Henceforth, both powers harbor a fear of the other. On both sides begins a witch hunt. In the United States, federal employees sympathetic to communist ideas are fired. Even Hollywood is used as a tool to produce anti-communist propaganda. In the USSR, any form of opposition is suppressed. Beyond ideology and clout, the two powers battle for influence in the fields of science, industry, space, sports and military. The Soviet Union invests heavily in industry and arms, and in 1949 tests its first atomic bomb. The same year, the United States sets up NATO, a military alliance between countries of the Western Bloc. Throughout the Cold War, there would be many indirect confrontations between the two powers and their allies. The first one takes place in Greece, where a rebel communist militia from the Second World War, supported by the Soviets and armed by Yugoslavia, enters into a civil war against a traditional monarchist party, supported and financed by Britain and then the United States. However, following tensions, the USSR breaks its alliance with Yugoslavia. As a result, Greek communists lose vital support and are forced to lay down their arms. Greece then becomes part of the Western Bloc. In China, after 3 years of civil war, the communists prevail over the nationalists who retreat to Taiwan. The USSR wins an important ally in the region that would influence two wars in particular. The first was fighting alongside communist North Korea against South Korea, which was supported by a UN-led international force directed by the United States. After 3 years of fighting, a ceasefire leaves the Korean peninsula divided in two.